So next up, it's 1:30, and next up is Josh Renaud, and his talk is going to be about saving the software curiosities of Ya'akov Kirschen. I hope I didn't butcher that name too badly, but Josh is going to tell us the little-known story of cartoonist Ya'akov Kirschen, his quest to break into the computer industry, and demonstrate some of his unique Apple II software. So let's take it away with Josh.
Hello, KansasFest. My name is Josh Renaud, and I'm here today to tell you the story of cartoonist Ya'akov Kirschen and his surprising computer software career in the 1980s. Now, this is my first time at KansasFest, and so I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a journalist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and in my spare time, I like to research and rescue obscure computer software and tell the stories of the people who made it and used it. And I share that stuff on my website, Break Into Chat. I've spent years diving deep into Ya'akov Kirshen's work, including interviewing dozens of people, obtaining hundreds of pages of documents, and imaging many floppy disks. In 2022, I published a dozen of Kirshen's games and software for the Apple II, Atari ST, Commodore Amiga, and IBM PC platforms. You can find them at breakintochat.com/Kirschen. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce you to Ya'akov Kirschen. For over 50 years, Ya'akov Kirschen entertained generations of Jews and Gentiles with his cartoon Dry Bones, which he used to poke fun at the absurdities of life in Israel and the hypocrisies of people everywhere. Kirschen began drawing Dry Bones in 1973 for the Jerusalem Post. At the peak of its popularity, in the late 1970s and 80s, Dry Bones attracted the attention of international leaders like President Jimmy Carter. Kirschen became almost a household name across the Jewish diaspora. Now, here you can see one of President Carter's handwritten notes to Kirschen responding to a Dry Bones cartoon. Kirschen kept drawing Dry Bones until he died a few months ago at the age of 87. Afterward, he was remembered in Israel as, quote, a national treasure, and as an artist who had, quote, an impeccable ability to capture the mood of a nation in just one drawing. But most of those tributes overlooked an important aspect of his life. Kirschen had been an innovative, if unsuccessful, software developer. Beginning in 1982, Kirschen used the clout and connections he had built with the success of Dry Bones to open doors in the computer industry. And for nearly a decade, he produced a range of educational games, as well as artificial personality and artificial creativity software that prefigured our current AI craze. Now, according to two experts, Kirschen was unique with his hands-on approach to computer software. Glenn Fleischman, a comics historian, and Susan Liberator at the Ireland Cartoon Museum told me that they know of no other cartoonists at the time who similarly created computer software. Perhaps the closest examples might be the author Douglas Adams, working with Steve Meretzky at Infocom to make an interactive fiction version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Or maybe Commodore hiring the artist Andy Warhol as a brand ambassador to create art with the Amiga computer. Kirschen was prolific, working on more than a dozen software projects. And while Kirschen and his creations were profiled in magazines and newspapers, none of it succeeded commercially, and almost none of it was pirated or preserved. Decades later, when I began reaching out to Kirschen and his wife Sally, they had already thrown away all of their Atari ST discs, and they were about to toss the 5.25-inch discs for the Apple II and IBM PC. Thankfully, I was able to obtain the remaining discs and preserve them, and now you can download much of Kirshen's work from my website, Break Into Chat. It has also been uploaded to the Internet Archive, where you can play some of it in your web browser. So how did this cartoonist end up in computers? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the 1960s, when he was still living in his hometown, New York City, and still known by his birth name, Gerald Neil Kirschen. In 1962, Kirschen was a college graduate, recently married, and he was trying to make his living as a freelance artist and cartoonist. He had had 4 cartoons published in Cracked magazine. He had been fired from a job drawing greeting cards, and he had made beautiful watercolor illustrations for 2 children's books for learning Spanish and French. These language books had been produced by a small firm called Reinforced Learning, where Kirschen landed a job. Reinforced Learning produced self-instructional training courses to help people learn new skills on their own, from Morse code to learning languages. And often they did this by listening and following along to tapes or records, like the one you see here. Kirschen got his first taste of computers when Reinforced Learning landed a big contract with the National Cash Register, or NCR. In the 1950s and 60s, NCR was at the forefront of electronic data processing, a technology which enabled banks and other businesses to automate their payroll and record keeping and shed costly clerical workers. But NCR needed a cost-effective way to teach people to operate and program its new EDP machines. And so, NCR hired Reinforced Learning to develop taped training courses that it could provide to its clients after they bought an EDP system. Kirschen was dispatched on research trips to meet with the computer scientists at NCR in Dayton, Ohio, and also at IBM in Endicott, New York. There, he learned the concepts they needed to know to write the training courses. These visits introduced Kirschen to computer programming and to ideas like game theory and the Turing test. But technology wasn't the only force upending American society in the late 1960s. It was a time of social and political upheaval, and Kirschen found his own beliefs changing. Though he had grown up in a Jewish family that wasn't particularly religious, he eventually became a Zionist, radicalized after his experiences as a delegate to the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Then, in 1971, he took the ultimate step. He uprooted his family and moved permanently to Israel, a process called Aliyah. In Hebrew, Aliyah means ascent, or to go up, and it refers to the immigration of Jews to go live in Israel. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum. Kirschen and his family left America at the peak of a surge in Aliyah decisions that had begun in 1969. Keep this in mind, because we're going to meet some other Americans in a little bit who had made similar choices. Kirschen imagined when he got to Israel that he'd start a new life with a new name in a new country. Maybe he'd be able to get some work in a high-tech industry, but it didn't really work out that way. Instead, he fell back on his first love, cartooning, and when he launched Dry Bones in 1973, it quickly became a hit, and he spent most of the next decade focused on it, which brings us to the 1980s. Now, the microcomputer revolution that had taken off in the late 1970s in the US, with the release of the Apple II, the TRS-80, Atari 400, and others, was finally reaching Israel. With his technical background and tinkerer's inclination, Ya'akov Kirschen dove in. He bought an Apple II clone, joined a computer club in Jerusalem, and began playing games and trading pirated software. Across town, another group had also begun embracing this medium. This organization, called Gesher, was dedicated to bridging the gap between secular and religious Israeli kids, and helping them embrace their identity as Jews. In the early 1980s, they began exploring how to use TV and video games to reach kids. Gesher's first steps into making educational computer games were taken by Toby Klein Greenwald. She proposed a historical adventure called Beat the British, or later, Aliyah Game. Players would face dilemmas inspired by the dramatic stories she had collected from immigrants who made Aliyah to Israel in the 1940s and 50s. They came from places like Europe, Yemen, and Tehran. Another Gesher staffer, named Nisan Ziskin, who you can see here on the right, was designing a game called Roots and Routes, where the player would try to maintain a family's Jewish identity as they moved between different Jewish centers of the world in different time periods. As you're probably noticing, Jewish migration, and Aliyah specifically, was shaping up as a major theme of Gesher's games. Indeed, this topic was personal for Greenwald, for Ziskin, for the founder of Gesher, and for many others who worked at Gesher at that time. They, just like Ya'akov Kirschen, had come to Israel from America during that Aliyah surge of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Gescher's first completed game was a simple quiz called Jerusalem Squares, and it was patterned on the popular Hollywood Squares TV show. They developed themed floppy disks with questions on different Jewish topics that could be swapped in and out. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find any copies of this game, and so this publicity photo may be all that we have left of it. Throughout 1981 and 82, Gescher's top brass would demonstrate this game anytime they came to the U.S. to visit local Jewish federations. And that led to their first paid gig. The Atlanta Jewish Federation hired Gescher to make computer games for the General Assembly. This was a huge Jewish convention that was coming to their city in 1983. That was the same year as the 250th anniversary of the founding of the state of Georgia. And so the Federation was planning a top-notch multimedia exhibit of the history of Jews in Georgia, and they wanted to incorporate educational computer games. Now, Gescher's team had big ideas, but they had little experience with art or graphics. And so, while it's not clear if Gescher sought out Kirschen or if he reached out to them, what is clear is that by late 1982, he was on board. He had what Gescher's programmers lacked: expertise in art direction and animation. Kirschen brought with him a talented teenage cracker and programmer named Danny Weisberg, whom he had met while trading pirated software. Danny had developed a graphics toolkit for the Apple II called Raster Master, which the Gescher team quickly incorporated into several of Gescher's games. So that's a bit of the history, but now what I like to do is take a look at 4 of the finished Gescher games. These are the only 4 that have survived. And again, these are available on my website. First up, we have 3 of Gescher's smaller action games: Noshkosh, Borders, and Aleph Baders. Each of these 3 was modeled on an existing arcade game, but repurposed to teach some aspect of Jewish life, from dietary law to history to the Hebrew alphabet. Let's start with Noshkosh. You can think of Noshkosh as like a kosher version of Pac-Man. Both of these games are all about eating while being chased by bad guys. In Noshkosh, the main character is named Chunky, and he wears a kippah or a skull cap. But instead of gobbling dots like Pac-Man, Chunky eats carrots, hamburgers, and ice cream. Veggies are safe to eat anytime, but you have to be careful with the meat and the dairy. Whenever you eat meat, you start a timer representing the 6 hours that Jews are supposed to wait before eating dairy. Meanwhile, you're being chased by 3 non-kosher bad guys: Peter Pig, Larry Lobster, and Freddy Frog's Legs. And so what I'd like to do now is show a video clip playing through the first level of Noshkosh. And what you're going to notice right away is that unlike Pac-Man, Noshkosh is visually dense and noisy. It's full of sprites. But one thing I've learned by playing is that there is a logic to the layout of the food sprites. So here at the beginning, I'm kind of going down some of these rows and columns that are sort of like carrot highways, if you will, where they're mostly carrots, and so they're fairly safe to go down. You don't have to worry about juggling the meat and the dairy. Oh, now right there, you heard me hit my first hamburger. And when you eat hamburgers, the timer starts and the sound effect changes. It becomes more of a clicking sound. You hear that click. And that's just like an audio clue that it's not safe to eat dairy yet, because the timer hasn't run out. But when the timer does run out, then it kind of reverts to the original sound effects. Now, when I really got into playing this game, I kind of settled on the strategy of eating the food in groups. So kind of trying to eat most of the burgers and then maybe like most of the ice creams, or vice versa. And that works pretty good in these, in maybe like the first couple levels. But as you get deeper into this game, the difficulty does increase. We'll talk about that after we get through the first level. But basically, the changes that happen between levels make that strategy somewhat hard to maintain. This is probably a good place to talk about the bad guys. As you can start to see, they're not really chasing Chunky. This is not like Pac-Man, where the ghosts sort of target you and chase you, and there's sort of a rudimentary AI. These bad guys, they have like a movement pattern that they stick to, but they never are really like targeting you specifically. And so, as we get to the end of this level, and I've cleared out most of the sprites, I really don't have to worry about the bad guys anymore, because they're mostly not in my way, and I can of course. Well, I mostly cannot worry about them and just eat the sprites and finish it up. And I'm happy to say I am going to finish this first level. There was a time when I could not beat the first level of this game, and this year I decided I am going to bear down and play this as much as it takes to start beating levels. And so now I can more consistently get pretty deep into the game. Okay, so here's level 2, and it's probably hard to tell, but the sprite layout has changed slightly. And basically what happened is that Gescher's game designers, the way that they increase the difficulty is by swapping out carrots for the trickier dairy and meat. And so each level that you play, we'll kind of see here, I've made a little animation showing how it changes from level to level. But as you play, the different carrot groups will get converted into either ice creams or hamburgers. And as you can see, when you finally get to level 5 there, it gets pretty tricky because there's so many ice creams and hamburgers. Okay, that was Noshkosh. Now let's take a look at the second small game, which is Borders. Borders is an action game about Jewish history in the style of Donkey Kong, which of course is famous as one of the first platform games to feature jumping. Borders also includes jumping and platforms, which you can see here. This is from the start of the game. In Borders, each of the platforms represents a different historical period during which Jews faced persecution. The goal is to move upward through each period to reach the end of the game. And to show you how that works, I'm going to play a little clip now demonstrating the beginning platforms of Borders. And you can see that there are period-appropriate bad guys. Oh, and they just got me. So in the Roman Empire, we're seeing Roman soldiers with their swords and shields. And what I have to do is touch the Torah. And when I do that, you'll see there's a little white platform-looking thing on the right-hand side that has appeared. It's an elevator, and it lifts me up to the next stage. And now we've got new period-appropriate bad guys. We're in Byzantium. And again, the formula here is you have to dodge the bad guys, hit the Torah, and then get to the elevator. And it will lift you up and take you further into history. So you can see that the screen is scrolling down, and it's basically going to keep doing that until we get to the end of the game, which is roughly the 19th or 20th century. Okay, so that clip we saw showed the beginning of the game. But one thing that makes this game unique and different from other arcade-style action games of the early 1980s is that it has an ending. And that's what I'd like to show you now. Here we are on the Russians and Cossacks. We've just finished that, and we're at the very top of all the platforms. And we're heading over to this ship. And when we get in it, you can hear the music. It's taking us to the United States, taking us from Europe to the land of liberty. You can see the Statue of Liberty there in the upper right-hand corner. There's a little steamship in the kind of off in the distance of the ocean. And when we get to the States, you'll see that the Geschers described some of the key aspects of the U.S. Video, hamburger heaven, pizza. But we've just touched the Torah, and now we've unlocked an airplane. And that is what's interesting here. We are not staying in the U.S. We are immigrating to Israel. We are making Aliyah. So the player in Borders at the end of the game is essentially reenacting this same journey that Ya'akov Kirschen and Nisan Ziskin and the others at Gesher had gone before, making Aliyah and coming to live in Israel. And so this is the final game screen. It's the city of Jerusalem. And so those Hebrew letters at the top, they spell Jerusalem. You can see Stars of David, the Torah, the Israeli flag, and this is kind of the reward for finishing the game. And so again, immigration is a major theme among these games. Okay, now let's talk about Aleph Baders. This is the third of the small games, and I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on this. We'll just take a quick look. But as the name indicates, this is a game that teaches the Hebrew alphabet. The action is loosely based on Space Invaders, and of course in that game you shoot at waves of aliens descending from the top of the screen. But in Aleph Baders, instead of aliens, it's Hebrew letters that are descending. And instead of blasting a laser cannon, you control a finger, and you have to poke it up at the next letter in alphabetical order. So we'll just take a look at a clip now of that. The first letter is Aleph, which is like alpha or A. And we got it. Now we're looking for Beit, which is sort of like the letter B. There it is. And then the next letter we need is Gimel, which kind of sounds like gamma. Let's see here. Nope, that wasn't it. Wrong one. Let's come over here. There it is. Okay, so anyway, that's a quick look at Aleph Baders. And those were Gesher's small games. But they also were planning what Nisan Ziskin described to me as their big games. He envisioned these as having much deeper, more thoughtful content, much richer educational content. Earlier, I described two of the big projects they were working on, which was Beat the British, or Aliyah game, and Roots and Routes. Unfortunately, neither of these games was ever fully implemented, although they were designed. Still, some of their DNA ended up in the final Gesher game that I'm going to show you today, which is the Georgia Variations. In this game, players play the role of a Jewish youth in Eastern Europe in the 1800s as he grows up and flees persecution in Eastern Europe, ultimately immigrating to Atlanta, Georgia. Now, this game was originally titled The Goldberg Variations, as you can see in this photo. And that's because the character is named Boris Goldberg. But as the 250th anniversary exhibit drew closer, they changed the title and they added content specifically about Georgia so that the Atlanta Jewish Federation could use this game in the exhibit. Now, unlike the three small action games that I showed you, this game was entirely original. It was based on historical images and research that had been gathered by David Geffen at Gesher. He was originally from Atlanta, and he drew heavily on his own family history in preparing material for the game, particularly the history of his grandfather, the Rabbi Tobias Geffen. Just like the Boris Goldberg character, Tobias Geffen was born in the city of Kovno, Russia, and Tobias Geffen moved his family to the U.S. after a pogrom, or a massacre of Jews in Russia. And this is a situation that can happen in multiple places in the Georgia Variations game. Now, you could describe the Georgia Variations as a choose-your-own-adventure game, or if you wanted to be a little more technical, you could call it a choice-based narrative. When you play, you make choices which affect the storyline, but in the end, all the threads eventually lead to the same ending. Goldberg immigrates to Atlanta, Georgia, and that's also where Tobias Geffen settled. So I want to show you now how that looks in the game. I'm just going to do this as a slideshow rather than as a video sequence because the game takes a while to load the different steps and choices and stuff. So we'll start here meeting our father Avram. He's saved some money and he wants to send us off for education. So should we choose gymnasium or yeshiva? Well, I'm going to go with yeshiva. And we get a little screen showing us an image of the yeshiva. And then we face our next dilemma. Our dad not only is arranging for our education, he's also arranging our marriage. And there's a girl named Merle who comes from a wealthy family he wants us to marry. But you know what? I am not feeling like getting married to this girl. So I'm going to say no. Ooh. And my father is angered by my refusal. It is accepted that parents arrange such things, the game says. And so he insists that I marry her. But you know what? I'm still not feeling it, so I think I'm going to run away. Ooh, this was to have been your wedding day, but you've packed your few belongings, and you've run away from the yeshiva and the marriage match arranged by your father. Ooh, so kind of somber there. And of course, this is where we're going to stop, but the game continues. There is more story after this. In fact, this game needed like 4 or 5 floppy disks, and depending on what choices you made, that would kind of control which disks you ended up needing. But ultimately, all the choices end in the same place. You end up going to Atlanta, Georgia. Now, Kirschen was very proud of this game, and in interviews he called it a rolly, which he spelled and defined several ways. ROLI, he said, was short for robotic literature. But then other times he talked about rolly, ROLIE, a story that you have a role in. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the Gesher games story. By fall 1983, the games were finished, and Kirschen brought them to America to show them off at several Jewish conventions. Gesher's big focus was the General Assembly in Atlanta in November. Kirschen even printed souvenir cards, like the one I'm showing here, to give away to everyone who played the games at Gesher's booth. But when it was all over, the games had not made a big enough splash. Within a couple months, Gesher had given up on trying to market them or sell them, and they cut their losses. Still, a handful of copies did trickle out in the years afterward. In 1987, one Jewish educational group in the U.S. made an arrangement with Kirschen to sell the games at cost, but probably fewer than a dozen copies of the games were distributed. A few academics wrote about the games in some journals, but these games really, they just remained forgotten, lost, unknown, until I rescued them and published them on Break Into Chat in 2022 and on the Internet Archive. So now we're going to talk about Kirschen's independent Apple II work. Working with Gesher had helped him to build up his skills. He had led a development team, and now he understood what it took to create a computer game, and he was ready to work independently. Kirschen told me that during a trip to the U.S. in 1983, he cold called the Learning Company, which was well known for its educational titles like Reader Rabbit and Rocky's Boots. He pitched them on a game called You and Doc Possum, in which a field mouse solves nature mysteries by visiting different habitats and interviewing other animals. The Learning Company was impressed enough by his pitch and by his previous work that they gave him money up front to finance development of the game. Kirschen consulted a biologist at the Jerusalem Biblical Zoo to write dozens of nature mysteries. And he hired Danny Weisberg, the teenager that we saw earlier, to work as a programmer on the game. Now, we don't have time to look at the game in depth, but one thing I do want to show you. After a player solves one mystery, they're rewarded with a breakdance show. And it's pretty fun. You can control the field mouse's dance moves and just kind of like change the style of the breakdancing. And it's just a fun way to finish after you've already solved one of the mysteries. Now, Kirschen told me that he delivered the finished game to the Learning Company in April 1984, but they chose not to publish or distribute it. It's not clear why. To me, the game looks polished and impressive, but whatever the reason, they took a pass. The game was released years later by Antic Publishing, which sold You and Doc Possum in the catalog of their short-lived Two Computing magazine. Now, Kirschen also created a few more demos and experiments for the Apple II. I'm not going to show those today. Some of them are kind of interesting, but all the ones that I recovered are available on the Internet Archive where you can play them in your web browser. Just search for Kirschen-software. Now, unfortunately, the most interesting of Kirshen's Apple II demos is lost. Actually, it's less of a demo, more of an experiment. It was a simulation called computology, in which the user is God and computer-generated entities pray to you for miracles. That would have been cool to see. Well, anyway, we've now gotten a taste of Kirshen's Apple II games and software. And with these final minutes, I'd like to introduce you to his later work for the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga. These projects involved three of Kirshen's big concepts: just for you, artificial personality, and artificial creativity. And we'll kind of talk about each of these as we go through. We'll start with artificial personality. In 1984, Jack Tramiel bought Atari and quickly began making plans to create a low-cost 16-bit computer to compete with the Macintosh. It would eventually be called the Atari ST. Kirschen struck up a relationship with Tramiel, who enjoyed the Dry Bones cartoon. Here you can see one of Kirshen's note cards, which had Tramiel's various phone numbers written on it. Kirshen's biggest idea at this time was just for you. Instead of mass-producing cheap, identical products, Kirschen dreamed of mass-producing unique items or experiences, each one customized just for you. He would achieve this by pre-producing different fit-together parts, which could be recombined later to create apparently endless variations. Kirschen took this idea to Tramiel and pitched the idea of a greeting card kiosk powered by an Atari ST, and it would generate customized greeting cards on demand. Tramiel agreed, and he helped Kirschen get financing to set up his own American software company, which he called Just For You, Inc. Kirschen got early help from Danny Weisberg, as well as his own daughter, Rachel. He later hired Israeli college students to serve as the main programmers on the project. One of them, Yoram Bieberman, you can see here. Also, Kirschen told me that the Atari ST that you see in this photo is one of the first dozen or so that was manufactured. Now, Kirshen's other big idea was that the kiosk should feature an artificial personality, a big cartoon character who would guide you through the process of making a greeting card. Kirschen believed computers and user interfaces should be friendly and human. His first artificial personality was in fact identical to Mr. Schuldig. That's the main character in his comic Dry Bones. Now, there is much more to this story, but time is tight, so suffice it to say that the greeting card kiosk did not succeed. Instead, at the request of Antic magazine, Kirschen spun off his artificial personality idea into two standalone graphical chatbots called Mom and Murray. Antic sold Mom and Murray in its software catalog, priced at $34.95 each. They were among the very earliest entertainment software available to purchase for the Atari ST. Still, despite the advantage of getting in on the ground floor of a new computer platform, and despite major profiles in newspapers like the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle, both Mom and Murray together probably sold fewer than 2,000 copies. And that brings us to Kirshen's third big idea: artificial creativity. Now, around 1986, he began working on a way to apply his Just For You concept to the creation of music. What I'd like to do is play you a clip from a BBC TV documentary that was released in 1988 called The Demjanjuk Dossier. Let's listen. Now, the music you just heard was generated by a computer and not a person. And maybe that's not surprising. In 2025, we're in the age of generative AI, but in the 1980s, this was a novel thing. The music was produced by Kirshen's Jiffy Box, a system that he and his team of student programmers had developed on the Amiga. This artificial creativity system was an example of an algorithmic composer. Kirshen's team extracted what they called the musical DNA of existing songs and classical pieces. And then their system would recombine these components in new ways to generate new music. Now, this system went through many iterations between 1986 and 1989. Originally, it was called Magic Harp, and the plan was to bundle it with the Commodore Amiga and to sell additional themed music discs to consumers. At least 2 such Magic Harp discs were completed, Pop and Baroque. Kirshen's wife, Sally, found a copy of the Baroque disc, which I have imaged and published, but the Pop version is lost. This photo of a Beatles-like group of artificial personalities is probably all that remains of it. Now, when the consumer idea didn't work out, Kirschen pivoted in a different direction. He tried to sell this system as like a turnkey solution that TV and film producers could use for generating low-cost background music. And just like before, Kirschen managed to get splashy coverage of his music technology in several news outlets, including the Los Angeles Times. But success did not follow. Finally, Kirschen ported his music technology to the PC, calling it the Music Creator. He made a deal with a company called Computer Music Supply to include the Music Creator as part of a $400 bundle with a MIDI interface and sound module. But it didn't sell well. After his failure to find a market for these new techniques, Kirschen was in deep financial trouble. He had applied for a patent and had made it through the first round, but he had to drop it because he didn't have enough money. And then he tried to use bankruptcy as a protection, but the Israeli bank just transferred the debt to him personally. "We even failed at bankruptcy," Kirschen joked to me. And so there you have it. Over the course of the 1980s, Kirschen produced around a dozen different games and programs for 4 computer platforms. And while most of his work was lost and unknown for decades, I'm proud to have played a part in rescuing it and making it accessible and available to people today. And again, you can find it on my website, breakintochat.com/Kirschen, or you can find it on the Internet Archive by searching for Kirschen-software. Kirschen was an amazing thinker and artist. His software may not have sold well, but he gave each project a unique sensibility. You know, computers can be cold and mechanical, and sometimes software can seem soulless. But in Kirshen's hands, they felt alive, brimming with creativity, personality, and humanity. Thank you.
Hi, Josh. Thank you. That was awesome. Just goes to show you, as old as you get, you always can learn something. That was very interesting. And there was a lot of chatter in the questions there. So without further ado, we have about 5 minutes here for questions or so. So let's get to them. The first one was from Ron. Do you know if there had been any broader efforts to preserve, the language software for the Apple II?
I can't speak to that specifically. There are like Israeli retro computing groups. There's one or two on Facebook that I'm part of, but I'm not like super active on them. So there definitely are retro computing folks in Israel. Whether there's like a formal effort, I'm not positive, but it would not surprise me to learn that there was.
Okay. Next one is, are there levels in Noshkosh static or dynamic? I think that was from Michael.
Yeah, so there's like kind of as I showed in the presentation, there's sort of like 5 level designs, but it seems like they begin repeating. So after you get past level 5, the design for level 6 is the same as level 1. So I think it's just like 1 through 5, and then they probably cycle indefinitely. I haven't gotten further, I think, than like level 7 or 8, but I would be shocked if there's some change beyond that.
This is a question for me. Did you end up getting the source code for the games or just the binaries for them?
For the Apple II games, only the binaries. The only source code that that I've obtained is for the PC version of the Music Creator, and I'm not sure that it's complete source code, but that is something that has not been published yet, but I am intending to publish.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, no, it has mostly been binaries, but some aspects of these games are sometimes implemented in BASIC. I think some of his experiments are maybe like done in BASIC, but like I mentioned, a lot of them use this kind of graphics library, so it's not the source code for that doesn't exist. And in fact, Raster Master by itself, as far as I know, doesn't exist anywhere. Although, like some of these floppy disks, it might be possible to obtain it from the floppy disks with like a special imaging setup, because some of these are reused disks. So I know I saw one or two that had other things underneath them. So I mentioned like Jerusalem Squares is lost, but one of these disks has, it's either like Oshkosh or Borders, is on a disk that originally had Jerusalem Squares. So like, could it be, if somebody had the right imaging setup, could they maybe like find some hidden leftover stuff, between the sectors or something? Maybe.
Sounds like a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Ken asked, what drew you to Ya'akov's story and prompted such exhaustive research?
Oh, okay. So I kind of pulled this out for time's sake, but my interest in this stems from the fact that I had copies of Mom and Murray as a kid. So I had an Atari ST, a hand-me-down Atari ST, and please don't boo me, but I'm an Atari guy primarily. But I did use lots of Apple IIs in like between 5th grade and 8th grade at school, and all of my early programming experience was on the Apple II. But at home, I had Atari stuff. And when we got this hand-me-down ST in the late 80s, early 90s, it came with a bunch of discs that my uncle gave us, including some copies of Mom and Murray. So I remembered those games from my childhood. And, maybe like 10 years ago, I was looking for an idea for a blog post on Mother's Day. And I remembered the Mom and Me. And I thought, oh, that might be something kind of fun. Just make a little video of that and post it. But when at that point in time, I did not have an Atari anymore. And so everything I did through emulation. And I couldn't find any copies of that software online. I could not find Mom and Me. It hadn't been pirated, which was a shock. I thought everything had been pirated. Yeah. And I just assumed that. And I quickly came to learn that actually some stuff slipped under the radar. And so, for example, 4AM has been doing all this amazing work to archive all this educational software, which is, pirates generally were not interested in pirated software. I mean, in educational software, unless it was the more, famous stuff. And so this Kirshen's work was exactly the kind of thing that, a few people bought. The Mom and Murray programs were the most popular of anything that he developed, because probably a few thousand of those were sold, but I don't think people like loved them or kept them or really pirated them. So anyhow, that was kind of the start of it, was this realization that, oh, not all software has been saved. And I actually had copies. I still had my 2 old discs. I just didn't have the hardware. And so that kind of like started this quest of, well, maybe I need to reacquire the hardware and see if I can salvage what's on these discs. And then the other part of it was like getting in touch with Kirschen himself. He was different from any other person I've interviewed. I'm breaking a chat. I have a lot of interviews with people who made stuff like BBS door games and things like that. But Kirschen was kind of weird, because when I started asking him questions, one of the first questions I asked was about his programming experience. In the 1985 New York Times profile, Thomas Friedman wrote that Kirschen had been a programmer for IBM and NCR. And I thought that was fascinating. How did he go from being a programmer to being a cartoonist? Well, that wasn't actually true. And so that was the first unraveling of some of the threads of this story that made it even more fascinating. Kirschen admitted that while he hadn't actually been a programmer, he had learned about programming to do this reinforced learning training course. And that, his story touches on so many things that I found fascinating, various rabbit holes, and it just has kept sucking me in. And even this morning, I just got, by coincidence, an email from someone I had reached out to several weeks ago, who is willing to talk to me and may shed a whole lot more new light on some things. So it's just like it keeps growing. It's taken on a life of its own.
Very interesting. So we're anxious to find out who's next. So I think that's all the time we have for questions for today. And everyone can just head over into the Discord, and I'm sure you'll be there, Josh, answering some more questions that are popping up there. So
I will.
Thank you very much, and that was great.
Thanks for having me. And let me just say really quick.
Sure.
Thank you to Keith Hack, Kevin Ing, Dan Heavey, and Scott Dunsing, who either helped me image discs or loaned me hardware, or in one case gave me a couple discs that they possessed that helped me image some of the things that were missing. So it wasn't just me by myself. I did all the research, but I certainly had help with saving the software. So I just wanted to say thanks to them. And thanks to you for having me. So
yeah, thank you.